Can you hear me? Okay, great. So if you're very perceptive, you would have noticed that everybody on the stage resembles a man. So it's an all-male panel, and that's odd because I think the novel survives on the generosity of women. It can be statistically proved, it can be empirically proved, but I think it's purely accidental. And I know that some people are going to call it manel. I think that is the term for a panel filled with men. I think manel, I think is the ugliest word in the English language after synergy. I hope you don't use that word in your Facebook posts. I know that most of you are writers, you're interested in writing. In that context, I know that this is going to be a very significant panel. Many people who attend these festivals want to get published. In fact, I think 5 years ago, there was a man who was carrying his manuscript, and there was a very famous author in the toilet. He went and surprised the author in the toilet. He wanted the famous writer to read his manuscript. I think those kind of things don't happen anymore, which is good. But 3 years ago, I saw James Kudzie walking very hastily out of a venue, followed by a large man who was eating a samosa, and he was chasing him and saying, "Give me a tip, sir, give me a tip." But still, I want to dedicate the first question to that man, that unknown man who was chasing Kudzie, asking for a tip. I'm going to ask the most lowbrow question these fine gentlemen have ever been asked. I'm going to ask them. You can't hear? Okay. Okay. So,
do you want to try the mic?
Yeah, I'll try the mic. Can you give me a? Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay, great. Just to sum up, I said some funny things, actually. Okay, what you need to know is that the first question is going to be very lowbrow. I think the audience knows why. What is the tip that you have to give to aspiring novelists? Paul, I know that you saw me. You want to take your mics? Yeah. Can we have one more mic? One more mic.
I don't have I don't really believe in advice too much, really. But, other than that writers write, I think it's pretty simple. Something that I guess I find myself telling my students, not directly, but indirectly, is to impress themselves, and to mean that, and not to just write something and be impressed with what they've done, but let what they've done really impress themselves.
Okay. Adam?
I think my main tip to an aspiring writer is to finish it. I think finishing immeasurably improves a manuscript. And I think also that actually the difference between, it seems to me often that the writing of a novel, that it's almost the last 5% of work that transforms something that's unreadable into something that's readable, that it's incredibly late in the process where the thing kind of emerges. So yeah, I think a very practical thing. And also I think don't be boring. It seems to me that to be boring is the worst sin. And so much of what is put out there as a novel or a film or whatever kind of takes too much for granted, its capacity to be interesting.
But if bores know what is boring, they won't be bores. So what are the things that make a novel boring that is somewhat that most writers are not aware of?
I think there are infinite ways to bore people. I think it's boredom of form, if you think that someone is just writing in the same kind of style or the same form that's been used before. Boredom of subject matter, if you think they're not imagining something new or kind of precise enough. I think the opposite of boredom is always precision, whether that's kind of stylistic or imaginative.
Richard, a tip?
Well, on the question of advice, I'm reminded of the story of I think it was Sinclair Lewis in the early days of American creative writing schools, and he went to the Harvard Creative Writing School, and he'd had a few under the belt. He was a little bit tipsy. He took the podium, stood up behind the lectern, looked out at these 500 or so very earnest, and as they were in those days, confident North American faces, and he said, "Hands up, who wants to be a writer?" And being North American, up went this forest of hands. And he stared at them for a moment as he tried to get his rheumy eyes to focus, and then he said, "Well, piss off back home and write something." And with that he stepped down, and that was the end of his lecture. I think, as de Maupassant said, writing's just a case of getting black on white. As Adam said, never be boring, but I think ultimately that resides in a humility towards the reader. And I was brought up in the church until I could escape it, and so I've got a very low threshold for boredom in consequence. And I think a writer is obliged to seek to win the reader every clause, every sentence, every paragraph, and give them a reason to go on to the next word, because the reader owes you nothing and you owe them everything.
Richard, as you know, is from Australia. This morning I asked him if on behalf of all Australians he would apologize for Brett Lee's music. He has not responded yet. We'll come to that later. Neil?
You know, who was the guy who woke up and he thought he was insane? And I think it was Dr. Johnson. And his biographer said, "Well, so what did you do when you thought you were insane?" He said, "Well, I sat down and I wrote a sonnet." And what was his biographer called? Anyway, he said, "So then when you finished the sonnet, did you know you were sane?" And he said, "No, I read it and I realized it was a piece of shit. Then I realized I was sane." Yeah, so, I mean, I think you have to be able to read your own work and realize when it's trash and when nobody else should read it. But I think a story wants to be told, you know, and if it wants to be told, it will come out. That's the only advice I have. If the story wants to be told, it will tell itself through you.
Alan?
Well, I always give the boring advice that if you want to be a good, if you want to be a good writer, you've got to be a good reader. And I found a lot of the trouble with people, the rare occasions when I've tried to teach writing myself, is that they've never actually read anything. And so that they have a very sort of limited sense of both of the possibilities of the form and of the potential weaknesses of anything that they're doing themselves. So you've got to study, you know, and you've got, there's inspiration, there's perspiration, and you've got to learn your craft. There will be, spontaneous genius which exceeds the bounds of craft or masters them immediately. But I think patience, small, close horizons when you're starting out is pointless if you're 19 starting to write a 500-page novel, because you're never going to finish it. You will have grown out of it by the time you get to chapter 3. So focus on short form, short stories. That's terribly modest and boring advice, but I think it's probably worthwhile.
Paul, is humor a performance, or is humor something natural and inevitable in some people?
Yes. Yeah. Just.
And
Yeah, I mean, I don't like make this distinction between humor and everything else. You know, it's all a byproduct of. You know, it's just there. It's not something I foster. I just write the way I write. It's not like I sit down and go, I'm going to write something funny. You know, I don't do that. So it's just, it's just there. I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer for that.
a few weeks ago, Lionel Shriver made a very controversial speech in which she was defending her right to write about things and communities she may not have experienced, because a writer has the right to write about what she wants. But she used a very interesting word to describe the novel. She said everything is made up anyway, everything is fake. So I was wondering, is there a distinction, just because you make up something in a novel, is there a distinction between what is fiction and what is fake?
For me, it's just the work. You know, I've been rewatching this Lionel Trilling interviewing Nabokov right after after Lolita hit the bookshelves. And what's so nice about it is how Trilling is like, yeah, I know you're full of shit. Everything you're gonna say is full of shit. Everything you're gonna write is full of shit. And that's the whole fun in the whole thing. You know, and it's like, he doesn't need an answer to anything. You know, for them, he's just having a really good time listening to Nabokov just pontificate. And he's like, the thing is, it's up to the reader to determine what's fact, what's fiction. You know, it's part of the process. It's, you know, I don't know. I mean, I'm only sold and only so aware. And this weird thing of authenticity coming up all the time. And I don't quite get that.
There's a bit I love in that interview where Trilling says he's trying to basically kind of get Nabokov to discuss whether or not he is Humbert, and you'd expect therefore Nabokov to say, well, of course I'm not kind of sexually interested in girls, and he says, no one could ever confuse me for Humbert. I mean, for instance, he confuses two types of moth. I would never do that, and it's just this wonderful. That's the only point at which he kind of chooses to differentiate himself. But the idea of the fake, I think, in relation to fiction makes very little sense. I mean, like, and also it seems to be denying the fact that we're very clearly fiction has also got its own kind of idea of what is true as well. You know, like, fake is such a pejorative word that it seems to me really unhelpful for kind of what's going on.
Okay. Alan, would you like to add to this?
Well, of course, I think the novelist ought to be able to write about anything, but there's certainly a potential for embarrassment if he or she is claiming to write about something which they have inadequate knowledge or experience of, and it's clearly revealed on the page. You know. So we're always talking about a certain level of ability combined with expertise, but the freedom imaginatively to occupy the experience of others is obviously utterly fundamental to the novelist, and it's their freedoms are actually not all that often exploited, it seems to me. And for years I used piously to say on sort of gay literature programs, well, of course, there's no reason why a straight novelist shouldn't write a novel written from the point of view of a gay person. It's just that nobody ever did. So I welcome it, but I'm aware that there are, of course, potential pitfalls. I mean, we all dread that thing of having our fiction fact-checked. And I've had fantastically pedantic letters from people describing a house in a book having been built in the 1830s. I'm very shocked, Mr. Hollinghurst, by your error. And in fact, the houses in that street were built in 1848. That kind of, I think I'm not bothered about these minutiae.
Alan, we were having a conversation about semicolons, and you were beginning to tell me what you thought about semicolons, the matter of style. Can you tell us your views on some of the punctuations that you love and some of the punctuations that you hate?
Well, I've always been very, very fond of semicolons. I'm sure you all have. And the idea of the sort of semi-termination of a sentence and the continuation, which is not a logical progression from what has been said before, but it's a further thought, which is nonetheless contained within the sentence. And unlike most texters, I mean, I use the semicolon button almost the whole time. I get to just sound like a terribly old-fashioned stickler for form and so on, but I do believe punctuation is important. And
Didn't someone say that semicolons are used by people who want to show that they've been to college?
yeah, that's probably why I do it. Yeah. And things like exclamation marks. You know, I mean, one can use them now and then to great. I mean, there was a total ban on the exclamation mark in kind of polite writing when I was growing up, but I think I have used, you know, probably 2 or 3.
When would you use an exclamation mark?
I used one at the end of the second sentence of my first book, actually, where
Richard, you
Well, no, I was just thinking there was an Australian writer in the 50s called Xavier Herbert who so detested semicolons he hacksawed off the semicolon button on his typewriter, which had the unfortunate effect of also taking out the comma, and it was seen to have a saddening effect on his style, and he persevered for several books before he finally bought a new typewriter with the punctuation restored.
Neil, you make movies and you also write novels. What is the essential difference between writing a novel and writing a screenplay?
I think you always think you're disguising yourself. I always think I'm disguising myself when I write a novel or a screenplay. You know, I always think, oh, I'm hiding under the persona of the character that I've decided to invent, you know, and then when I look at them several years later, I realize I'm so naked in this thing, and it always shocks me. You know, I always think any kind of fiction or any kind of fakery is a real disguise, you know, and I try to use it as disguise, either in a movie or a novel, but it actually never functions as disguise. And sometimes I look at a film I've done years ago and I go, that is such a confessional piece of work, and I didn't even know it at the time, you know. So, I mean, I find them the same thing, really, but I'm an odd fish because I started writing before I started making films, and then I continued writing, you know. So there's a different. Obviously, the writing is much more interior than the filmmaking, but there's a huge gift you have if you're making a movie, is those little things in your brain, you know, those little instincts that you can't quite put a word to. Everybody demands you articulate them, you know, so you're actually articulating the fiction, you know, almost in 24 hours a day for the 6 or to 10 or 14 weeks you're making a film, you know. And to that extent, they're amazingly similar, but nobody ever says that, you know. But I've been lucky because I've managed to make probably 4 or 5 movies that have been absolutely uninterfered with, you know. And the other ones, I kind of regard them as something different that I try to forget about, you know. But
I know both forms are difficult, but which is more difficult between the novel and the screenplay?
oh my God, a novel is far more difficult. Are you insane? Yeah. I mean, making a movie is easy. You know, you write a script, and the words don't even have to go to the end of the page, you know. You go exterior something day, that's the first line, you know, and the next few lines kind of, and the dialogue just fills. But with a novel, you got to fill the whole bloody page, you know. And there's only you. There's no designer saying, well, should this be puce, or should it be green, or should it be pink, you know. There's only you and your typewriter, you know, and your semicolons, which I'm not even sure whether I ever use them or not. But
Richard, you've been wanting to say something.
I just think, going back to some of the earlier conversations, that there is a huge fear of fancy and fantasy and the power they have to allow us to divine the truths about ourselves. And so you're frequently finding yourself having to lie and say the novel's inspired by this or that. But as Flaubert said when they pressed him on who actually was Madame Bovary, because it was inspired by an incident by a woman who'd been found guilty of adultery who committed suicide near his village. But he famously replied, Madame Bovary c'est moi. And I think ultimately every work is just a cracked diary of that writer's soul for the time they're writing it. But they use this motley of story and character to communicate that soul to readers. It is the case that good wine needs cheap glass to hold it, and so do those things in our soul that we seek to share with readers.
Now, I think we should move on to sex. There's something about male writers and sex and literature. I mean, if you want to become celibate, I think you just have to read some of the sex passages in some highly acclaimed books. So it's a mystery why sex seems to be such a difficult thing to write about. Alan, for no particular reason, I want to start off with you. I feel that you write the most exquisite sex scenes.
Thank you so much, Manu. It's the nicest thing anybody's said since I got here. Well, what's the question?
How does one write sex?
Well, when I started out as a novel, I decided writing about sex was going to be kind of the main point, you know. So I had to give it quite a bit of thought. I think I just thought that if I was going to do it, and I was writing about gay sex, which hadn't really got a kind of contemporary literary treatment at the time. The thing was to write about it as clearly and exactly and as humorously as you would about any other kind of human interaction. And that was just my hunch, and it was sort of how I did it. And I think I tended to write books which were rather permeated by feelings of longing as well, so that there was a sort of a slightly sexualized kind of ambience, you know, that the narrator would be madly obsessed with somebody, or and all those sort of things are quite easy to set up in conventional ways. But the actual writing about it, I just thought you had to be sort of clear and amusing about it.
Neil, sex?
About sex? I've never written about sex, actually.
Okay.
I look forward to it, you know. I'm sure it'd be a great experience.
Why haven't you?
I've made a few movies with sexual scenes in them, and which always provokes extreme embarrassment in everybody, the actors and the director and the crew, and ultimately the audience who have to see them, you know. I don't know, I've found sex scenes stop everything, you know. They stop the development of the story, they stop the development of the drama, they rarely give rise to eroticism or to erections, you know, but they can give rise to an enormous amount of embarrassment, so I generally try to avoid them.
That's very interesting. Richard?
Well, I think it's been an odd period in literature the last 100 years. It would be as if meals were banned from the novel for 4 centuries and suddenly you're allowed to write about them. There'd be extensive chapters on mastication, but it wouldn't be necessarily to the point or that interesting. And I think what novels are better at dealing with are the causes and consequences of sex as they are with the causes and consequences of violence. There's it's something that you have to be, to echo Adam, enormously precise about, and to dwell on it too much is to misrepresent how it exists in our lives. It's about the causes and the consequences that are the stuff of our existence.
Yeah, I kind of agree with all of this and also slightly disagree with some. I mean, like, I think what's fascinating about writing about sex is how much it's an internal event as much as a physical event, as it were. You know, that like no one stops. There's some romantic myth that you stop thinking or feeling when you're having sex, and everyone knows this is untrue. And certainly whenever I certainly began my first novel kind of wanting to sort of, I felt there was a whole area of kind of sex that hadn't been described, of precisely embarrassment and shyness and awkwardness. And so that kind of comic aspect and sort of psychological aspect seemed to be really interesting. And actually, in a kind of weird way, I think it can speed a story up as much as it, you know, I think I agree that in so many films, the sex scene has become like a genre where everything pauses. And in the novel, I think it can be very different because it can actually be almost a speeded up version of a conversation. And so I find, I mean, certainly when I began writing, I was hugely influenced by Henry James, and this might seem a kind of giant leap from, but like one of James's obsessions was with like the most economic scene possible. And it seems to me that a sex scene can often kind of contain the most meaning in as short a space as possible. So, and also I think there's an embarrassment. It goes back to this idea of fact and fiction, of since it's so often presumed that all writing is autobiographical now, I think there's a difficult contract when you're writing sexually as to how much you're kind of the preponderance of the lyrical sex scene is, I think, because no one wants to admit to having any other type of sex.
Yeah, I don't do it very much. Usually like once a book, I think. But there's an old Woody Allen stand-up routine where he's talking about trying not to have an orgasm. He thinks about having a baseball game in his head. I don't know if anyone knows this. But I kind of try to write about a little bit what you were saying, about what's happening in the head. And then usually there's something, a third thing. Like, so it's the two people having sex, but they're also doing something else at the same time, which is the important thing, and the thing, like as you said, that kind of is moving it around. It's not about the sex. That was just an opportunity for this other thing to happen.
Okay, they want to be close. Okay. So what is the role of sex in a scene like that when something else is going on? So why have sex in the first place? Maybe they could be washing clothes or something.
I mean, I think one thing it can do is you can show that, that the two people, while engaged in the same thing, have two different agendas happening at the same time, And so that's one use of it.
And I think Richard's right about this being, part of a historical pattern too, and it was really in the 1960s, I think, and probably writers like John Updike in the United States, that in kind of literary fiction, writing very sort of explicitly about sexual behaviour it was a new subject, and it had the interest of novelty because it hadn't really been done outside pornography, on the page. And then I think the sort of gay thing I was describing came with a similar sense of sort of fresh originality afterwards. But now, I mean, it's all too often, like the thing you're saying in a film, it's a sort of a routine and embarrassment that you want to get over.
It's dreadful in television, Seriously, in these TV series that they do, it is really so, excuse my language, so tedious, I mean, I've written something they're shooting at the moment in the south of France, and these networks, they just want these dull sex scenes everywhere, and they want them to be kind of transgressive, and so everyone's always going down on the other person, and somebody's on their mobile phone, and it's like, please stop it, it's like, get the point, it's like, maybe that's just me. I'm an Irish Catholic, I suffer for severe embarrassment generally about sexual matters. But
yeah, I noticed you said dull and transgressive sex, so I've never seen these two
I don't know what
words.
transgressive sex is anymore, but I know these television executives think they know,
Richard, in your readings, do you see a distinction between how women write sex and how men write sex?
I think you look at women's writing in the last 20 years. It's opened up huge new dimensions to what the novel can be, because it represents experiences that were never there. So yeah, absolutely it has. I think there's so much about the necessity of women's writing for simply for the sake of the emancipation of women, but it forgets how liberating it is also for the novel, because it reminds everybody of how of the vast areas of human experience which no writer went to. And I guess it's Alan's point too about gay writing. There were other people simply weren't writing it. So, of course it's made a huge difference.
Have you read Emer McBride's The Lesser Bohemians, have you? No? Nobody's read that book? It is the most sexually honest book I have ever read by a man or a woman. And it is extraordinary. Emer McBride, do you know the novelist who wrote?
I do, yes. No, I'm not read
her
it,
second book is entirely about a young woman, a young Irish woman in London, and her sexual obsessional relationship with this older man who's an actor. And it's extraordinary. It's the best sexual writing I've ever read, apart from your own. Sorry.
I think we may have to sadly move away from sex. Most modern Indian writers in English live under certain norms. In fact, all our works are called post-colonial. That's bizarre. If you want accuracy, why don't you just call it post-Jurassic? I think that is more accurate than post-colonial. So there are these norms that novelists live under. So I wonder, is there a certain oppressive mainstream that keeps trying to tell you how a novel should be? Well, what is a good novel, and what are the things you can do, and what are the things you shouldn't do? Do you also live under those somewhat invisible norms? Paul?
No.
I want to ask you, Paul, is the most painful thing about writing, having to talk about novels?
It is.
Okay,
It's true.
I sense that.
That's all right. Yeah, no is the answer. I don't even know how to start talking about this, to be honest. But yeah, I mean, of course, these norms are there, and you know, I'm not completely oblivious to them, but yeah, I mean, I get into not debates about this, but for me, it's just good and bad. You know, that's it. And I think you can do anything on the page. If you can conceive it, you can do it. And it's just good and bad. Like in the States, there's this big thing about how much pop culture can you have in your book. So the students are always aware of this because teachers are saying, don't put mobile phones in, you know, this modern technology. And that stuff is hard to render, but it can be rendered. And I think one of the things that freed me up in at least in terms of that as a way to or a how to or a don't, was kind of rereading Dante's Inferno. It's this beautiful book, and it's, you know, full of these references to these bishops and these popes and these mayors of Venice and all this stuff. And I was like, oh, this is all this pop culture stuff that not so important to me. It's all the contextual stuff that's always going to carry it, you know? And so that for me was somehow a relaxing of my language, my references, and all that kind of stuff about what I need to worry about, how much do I need to explicate, you know, and yeah.
Adam, you're associated with the Paris Review, and that's as elite as one can get in the literary establishment. In a way, you decide what's good and what's rubbish. So do you see an establishment? Do you have to also deal with a certain establishment which tries to decide what is literary novel? What is a literary novel? In fact, actually, can we try to understand, because it's a wonderful panel to talk, what is a literary novel to begin with, actually?
I love the idea that I'm the establishment. I think for me, with a literary novel, I mean, I think it's a meaningless. I mean, all it can mean, I suppose, is it's not a novel with any recognized genre, maybe. But then, since so many, you know, really interesting novels are going to play with genre and kind of use genre, I'm not even sure that's a kind of distinction. I guess for me, the only novels I care about are the ones where I think that, you know, the style and the form has been obsessively kind of worked over, and I don't know whether that means it's kind of in a genre of its own, like kind of fine dining has its kind of own genre, you know, whether the literary novel is like the Michelin-starred restaurant. But I think it's simply about a kind of trying to write something that's unique. That seems to me the only thing that I'm interested in reading. And it's that kind of concern for that each novel will be its own thing, and that, you know, the style you invent will be not the same as anyone else's. That is all I think I care about as a reader, certainly.
I think adjectives are prejudice judgments, and the word literary novel makes no sense. I mean, was Homer a literary poet, or was he a poet? You know, there was an invention of marketing departments of publishers after the Second World War. You know, Kafka wrote A Cage Went in Search of a Bird. The term literary novel is a cage in search of a bird, but a novelist doing their job is the bird flying free.
You made some observations about the American form of novel writing, haven't you, in the past? Made some observations about the American expectations from a novel. If I've not misread you, would you like to say something about that?
Well, I should say I'm happy to be on a panel with Paul, who completely ignores all those. But there is that modern American novel that you risk asphyxiation with when you go to bed, or dislocation of your shoulders, that it's so huge. And one of the things it does that I find very odd is that it tells you everything about a character. That absolutely everything. Why they did this, why they thought that. And of course, we're unknown to ourselves. Far less do we know anything about anybody else. And I said this morning, I quoted Chekhov, who wrote to Gorky, it is for the writer to describe what his characters do and say and think. It is for God and the reader to judge. And on that subject, you were talking about literary establishments and that. I'd like to tell you a quick story about my first novel, which came out in a very small print run of 3,500, but there was no support because I knew no one in the literary world. The publisher was uninterested, but readers liked it. It sold out in a fortnight, and the publisher refused to reprint it, saying that's very odd, but clearly you've been lucky, and that's it. And then readers kept going back to the shops asking for it. So in the end, that forced a reprint. And that sold out in 3 days. And the publisher said, well, that's even stranger, but now you've been exceptionally lucky, and that's it. No one would review it. The Sydney Morning Herald, which is Australia's leading broadsheet, the literary editor said, this book fits into no recognisable school of Australian fiction, which was the loveliest compliment I was ever paid. And so it went. And it went this way for about a year. And then finally the book was allowed to stay in print because it had become a bestseller. And only later did the reviews, the praise, the prizes followed. And I realised then that the writer's fundamental contract is not with literary society or literary culture or literary patrons. It is with the reader. A writer is someone with readers, and if you hold to that, then you're in with a chance of writing something that might have meaning.
Do you think between the writer and the reader, do you think are there layers that writers have to deal with before you can reach the readers? Is that a problem?
Are there what?
Layers or various establishments between the writer and the reader?
No, because I think if there is one justification for the novel in this world in which everywhere we look we're having razor wire run down our hearts, it is that it reminds us we're never alone, and that the best and worst in another human being is also the best and worst in us.
Yeah.
So that if you can struggle, and it is always an enormous struggle, to represent what you discover in your own soul, if you can do that with enough honesty, clarity and courage, then you have a chance of writing something that will mean something to the reader.
Neil, whether writers like it or not, writers have to investigate the human mind. What do you think sanity is?
Sanity?
Yeah, is it as common as people make it out to be, or is it a minority condition?
It's a condition I would really aspire to, you know, but that's what an odd question, you know, really. I mean, I don't know. I think I have met many insane people in my life, and I found them absolutely fascinating, you know. I think the disordered brain is much more interesting than the ordered one, you know. And, you know, you meet in Ireland, you meet a lot of strange people on bicycles who have obsessions with odd periods. Sorry, I'm just talking bullshit now. I don't even know what you asked me. Are you?
No, you're not. I could reframe. Is sanity overrated?
Pardon?
Is sanity overrated?
Overwritten or overrated? It's probably overwritten. No. I'm sure sanity is a great thing, but it's, I mean, you know, I think you asked what a literary novel is, okay? Isn't it, a literary novel is the one you don't find in airports, isn't it, basically? And I published a book once, and for some reason it turned up in San Francisco Airport. I went, what on earth is that book doing? You know, on one of these stands, you know, with like a specially made cardboard kind of box thing to hold it. I said, what on earth is that book doing there?
It's called a dump bin.
It's called a what?
A dump bin.
A dump bin, okay.
Yeah.
But sanity is...
That says it all.
I really admire sanity, you know, and I'd like to get there someday.
Alan, what are some of the most underrated aspects of writing that people usually don't talk about? For example, the importance of conjecture or intuition, which helps writers write experiences they have not encountered. would you like to talk about the importance of conjecture or other underrated things of writing?
I don't know that I would really. Well, I suppose, I mean, writing about anybody who isn't immediately modelled on oneself is a form of conjecture. And constructing a story about a whole lot of these people who didn't exist, you know, is a further large-scale conjecture. And putting someone into an imagined situation is, if you like, a form of experiment. And I think that's actually perhaps something I have been quite interested in doing in fiction, you know, of introducing, say, an outsider into an established world and seeing what their effect upon it is. So if conjecture is, in a sense, if the novelist's conjecture is a form of social experiment, if you like, yeah, I think that's one sense I might be able to make of your question.
Anybody else?
I mean, I'm very, to go back a bit to what you were saying about the kind of expectations of the novel. I mean, it seems to me that I have a sense that I'm getting somewhere when I'm defying those expectations. And what I think I want to do more and more is to write novels which are not like novels, but which are more and more like life. And I think as I get older, I'm more and more interested in representing things like the passage of time and the effects of memory and so forth. And these demand other forms from conventional ones. And I suppose one's come a long way from the kind of boy meets girl or even boy meets boys story and its resolution. But I've increasingly disliked the formula of the novel in which there's an important secret which is revealed just before the end, and suddenly everything makes sense, you know, because life's not like that. So I've become increasingly interested in writing novels which are essentially open in form and leave all kinds of things which would, you know, an airport novel might require to be resolved, unresolved, and things unexplained. There's a wonderful British novelist whom I'm very devoted to, I think you are too, Penelope Fitzgerald. And she wrote beautifully lean, economical, laconic novels. And she has many notes to herself. She writes something and then says, "Do I have to explain this? I certainly wouldn't want to have this explained to me." And that's rather become my mantra now. Don't explain. Let the reader imagine.
Great. We'll open the session to the audience. If you have any questions, please. Yeah, the lady out there, 6th row, yeah. Both of them are, one after that. Yeah.
Hello. My question is for Paul. In your book, The Sellout, there's a chapter with 3 words, right? So I wanted to know if you intended to convey something specific with that, or is it a part of the broader narrative? Thank you.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the second part.
So, do you want to convey anything specific with with those 3 words, or is it just the broader narrative and it fits into that?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. One, it was all I had to say in the moment, you know, and it was sort of like a wake-up call and a shout-out to like this imaginary reader I had to. By the way, we're just kind of in the same gang and the same clique. Just like a quick, you get this or you don't kind of thing. And yeah, that was it, you know, yeah.
Hi, my question is, do you like the books you have written, and how does that influence the next book you write? And also a comment to JLF, it's a bit deflating to go from the images of all the women's marches around the world to an all-men panel on writing fiction.
Well, all yours.
Do you like any book you've written? See, I mean, nobody reads my books, but I love them dearly, you know. And I love all of them. And I'm sorry I'm not female. I don't know what happened. No, but it is odd there is no woman writer here, isn't it? Because in Ireland, where I come from, where writing is basically a blood sport, you know, every 6 months some new genius comes out and tries to confer the entire of the baggage of their predecessors to history. All of the new geniuses are women and have been for probably the last 6 or 7 years. Some of the most profoundly great writers are women. So I don't know, but blame somebody else, not me.
Not me, actually. They should have found a different moderator at least.
I mean, I think it's a perfectly valid point, and I would say that, you know, we had the Latin American boom in the 60s, there was the Indian boom, but now it is the women's boom. I mean, the best books, as Neil's saying again and again, are being written by women. And it doesn't really, ultimately, it doesn't matter whether they're represented. I mean, they should be represented here, but the point is the great books are being written by them and they're being read. I mean, you look at the Ferrante phenomenon. The best book I read last year, Han King, The Vegetarian, Orson Shire's poetry. I mean, there's so much extraordinary being written by women, and it opens up perspectives that are so new to literature. And on the subject of the women's marches, I was looking at the press on that this morning about what an extraordinary thing to see so many women around the world. I found it quite an enormous cause for optimism at such a dark time.
Would you like to take that question?
Yeah, I suppose I do like my books sometimes. Most of the time, I guess. Not all the time. As far as the gender bias of the panel, and I don't think of things in booms and stuff. I mean, there's a book that I found called Oreo by a woman named Fran Ross. And it was a genius book, and the reason why it didn't boom at the time was it was written by a black woman, you know, and I think the good stuff is always out there. It's, you know, I think the problem sometimes is our accessibility, our awareness, our recognizing that the stuff is out there. Which is not to say that things don't change or anything, but I think the good stuff is always out there by everybody, you know, and it's hard to get to, you know. And so some of that boom is in an expansion of the bookshelf, you know, in our mind and in the store and the publishers. But it's not a change, for me at least, in the talent or what the people are actually doing, you know? I think the good stuff is always out there, but we just don't always find it.
I think part of it is, it's a bit like what we were talking about with why are there not kind of more gay novels written by straight men, as it were, that it takes talent to be a reader as well. And I think often readers, I know this for myself, like you have to kind of watch, are you just reading kind of the same book essentially again, you know? Are you actually, and I think part of the women's boom as well has been also a kind of capacity for male readers as well to kind of give up that kind of hegemonic idea that they only want to read books about men or by men. And so I think that kind of, it takes creativity to read as well, as much as, you know, to have that imagination. In terms of my books, I think I'm always liking a book while I write it, and the moment it's finished, I want to disown it and never look at it again. I have a huge shame, I think, of kind of, so that often each new book is an attempt to somehow kind of obliterate the other books and pretend they didn't exist, and that pleasure lasts for about 5 minutes.
Yes, I think I have a similar. I'm quite pleased when I got to the end, but the pleasure is always undercut by a sense of how much better it could have been, and how much better if I took another year over it, it might yet become. And so there's an element of discontent about them all. And I don't really. I mean, occasionally I go back just because I don't want to make sure I'm not repeating myself, and I go back and look at how. Probably a sex scene, how I described it last time, and make sure I don't use the same phrase again. But they sort of stand there in an increasingly sort of shadowy way in the past. And I hardly know whether I like them or not, actually.
Would you like to add to this?
Oh, well, I feel a bit like Keith Richards when they asked him, did he think the Rolling Stones were a good band? He said, no, I've seen some good bands, we're not one of them, but we did our best. You know, I've read some good books, I don't count mine amongst them, but, you know, I did my best. And I'm glad that I've got to the age I am and no one's blown the whistle on me yet, and I'm still allowed to sit at the table each morning.
Yes, the first row, please, yes.
To all the panelists, do you keep saleability in mind when you write? And is the choice of sex in your novels, if you use them, an eye at saleability?
Do you write to sell more copies? Do you have saleability in mind?
Saleability. She said, do you write with saleability in mind?
Look, I can't even work out what I like, so second guessing what anyone else would like would be a very foolish thing. So I don't write for sales, no.
Does anybody else want to take that question?
I guess we all feel more or less the same about it. But, anyway, we'd be very unlikely to admit it if we did.
I don't know if this is a bit of a silly question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So when you assess your books after you've written them or while you're writing them, you said it's just about good or bad, and authenticity is, well, overrated and we talk about it too much. But have you ever imagined your books written by someone of a different gender and a different sexuality or a different class or a different race? What would it look like, or what would it read like if they had written it? Have you ever thought about that?
No. Have you?
I think I've thought of myself as a different race or a different gender. Like, what would I be like? But I think I've been getting this question a lot lately: is could a white person have written your book? Which I find I don't use this word very often, offensive. You know, because I think hopefully no one could have written the book. I mean, it's kind of obvious. I think so. You know. And I want to talk to the sales thing in a weird way. It's, you know. Oh, I'm sorry. You know, my books, I mean, until this last one, really haven't sold very well, but I think is one of the things that I did with this thing is I tried to write a book that people couldn't ignore, you know? It's not why I wrote it, but in the process. But I wasn't thinking about sales necessarily. You know, I was trying to just think about something that people had to, you know, even if you hated it, you know, or you couldn't deal with it, you just couldn't ignore it. And it wasn't something about sales, though, but that was in my head, I had to say, you know, with this most recent book.
But guys, you've got no excuses because, you know, if you make a movie, I mean, I do wake up 20 years later and think, God damn it, that's what I should have done with that last scene or something like that. Do you understand what I mean? Or why did I let them persuade me to do this? But you have full freedom, don't you? You know? I mean, if the book is not what you want it to be, can't you make it what you want it to be? Or is that a stupid question? Sorry.
You mean a remake of the book?
No, but you can return to the novel, can't you? Or finish it until you're happy with it, or exhausted by it. Isn't that's the pleasure I find in writing a book, is nobody's telling you what to do, and nobody's saying, hang on, I don't like this bit, or shouldn't the music be better, or could the central character not be more sympathetic, you know, which is generally what I find. But, I mean, isn't the point of the novel that it can be everything that one wants it to be? And if it isn't good enough, one has failed oneself, hasn't one? Or is that a stupid question? Sorry.
But don't you think, I think the question of time comes into this, because it may be exactly the book you wanted to write at that precise time, but then hopefully you will then become a different person, as it were. And so certainly I think what it is, it's not so much that I'm unhappy in the making, but that it's only 5 years later, 10 years later, that then I think who I am now would not write the novel in that way. So maybe that kind of gets back to your question of then there is a new person every new novel.
I mean, I would say there's no such thing as a perfect novel. The purpose of writing is to be defeated by ever greater things. And it is, every novel I really admire is in another sense an enormous failure, but there is in that space between the failure and the ambition what matters to the reader. It is a moment of time, and it is such an expression of what it is to be a human being, and human beings are not perfectible or perfect, and nor can the novel be. That's my own feeling.
But isn't the point of the fact, the joy of the fact that it is a novel, it expresses all of your imperfections and all your ambitions and all your failure, even in those ambitions, but it expresses you, not Harvey Weinstein or not the BBC or not somebody else. Do you understand what I mean?
Oh, yeah, I understand that fully, and no one says to you, as they do in movies, rewrite the last chapter like Wilbur Smith, because Wilbur Smith's selling this month, which is what happens in movies all the time. But it's interesting when writers, and you often, it's not that common, but often writers become well known and they go back to their early works written 20 or 30 years before and they rewrite them with the aim of trying to take out the vulgarities and imperfections of youth. They normally see the early work as overwritten. And what they end up doing is they hone it and they polish it, but the flaw in the glass that gave it its soul has also vanished with the imperfections. Everything that's great in a novel is also a failure. And the two things are so closely aligned that you cannot remove one without removing the other, in my experience.
It's weird. People are always asking me about. I used to write poetry, and people are always asking me about the distinctions between poetry and fiction. And when you asked that question, the first thing I thought of was Whitman's Leaves of Grass, which he always had rewritten and rewritten and rewritten, and I love that. And there's a book by Claudia Rankine called Citizen, and in a weird way, she's trying to use the technology now to rewrite her book. I mean, a lot of it is about, social and cultural violence against Black Americans. And at the end of the book, she's got a list of Black people who've been killed by the police. And part of her contract with the publisher is they have to add a set of names every time they do a reprint to the book, in a weird way of trying to kind of do what you're talking about, of being in the moment and then of being of the next moment at the same time. I'm not sure how I feel about it in a weird way. But
I mean, Whitman embarked on this quixotic quest of seeking to perfect the imperfectible, and in the middle of Leaves of Grass he writes, "The words of my book nothing, the drift of them everything." And that's the nature of writing. Flaubert, in the middle of Madame Bovary, the man who thought you could always find, if you worked hard enough, the perfect phrase, the exact wording, suddenly leaps out of the book and leaps out of that omniscient narration that he's so famous for, and says, why is it that none of us can ever express the exact measure of all our thoughts and sorrows and love? And all human speech is a cracked kettle upon which we tap crude rhythms for bears to dance to, when all the time we long to move the stars to pity. And it is that paradox that all writers have to live. They long to move the stars to pity, but know at the end they're just cracking a crude kettle for bears to dance to.